Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for braving the rain to come to this. Well, it's going to be a fascinating event and really timely. My name's Diane Coyle. I'm an economist. I've been researching the digital economy since the 1990s, so since it was invented pretty much. And I'm one of the co-directors of the Bennett Institute, which is an interdisciplinary public policy institute based upstairs here. And we do a wide range of work, but like everybody else, increasingly AI features in that, and my own perspective on it is thinking about productivity issues. But today it's elections. We've got two panels, one on regulation and one on misinformation and deepfakes. So my role is entirely ceremonial. I just need to tell you that the toilets are across the atrium if you don't know the building, and if there's a fire alarm, please go. The host for this evening is actually Walter Pasquarelli, who's one of our research affiliates and a well-known thinker and speaker on all matters AI. So I'm going to hand straight over to you, Walter.
Thank you. All right, well, thank you so much for coming, everyone. Really excited about this conversation that we'll be having today. I think the context or the importance of today's conversation is actually really rests on two fundamental developments that are happening nowadays. One of them is what we are witnessing sort of in the world of artificial intelligence, with increased investments really going into the field, the capabilities of these systems really like scaling, becoming more precise, becoming faster, becoming more realistic in the outputs that we produce, as well as, of course, this year, what we call the year of elections. 2024 is the year where the highest number of countries in the history of political elections, I guess, if one could say that, will be going to the ballots. And that's going to have massive implications for democratic institutions and processes. And that combination of these two developments, for one, the advancements of artificial intelligence tools, as well as this number of elections that are taking place today, we thought would make actually for a very nice occasion for have a conversation about how these two trends are interacting with each other. So we have two panels that we've prepared for you today. One is a panel where we will be discussing sort of like trends in innovation, as well as the regulatory environment and what is exactly needed in order to secure a future in which democratic institutions are protected and potentially even enhanced by developments in AI, as well as one that I think is intimately related to that, which is about media integrity, especially in light of AI-generated synthetic media. So for the first panel, I'm very pleased to be welcoming here on stage Tom Mason. Tom used to be the former CTO of Stability AI, the company that used to develop these media outputs of the very realistic images and very realistic videos that you see. As well as Dr. Gina Neff, who is the Executive Director of the Minderoo Center for Technology and Democracy, and of course Dr. Ella McPherson, who is Associate Professor of the Sociology of New Media and Digital Technology at the Center of Governance and Human Rights. Thank you so much for joining me. Right, so I would like to get started with just a very, I'll say even a simplistic question, which is about the impact of artificial intelligence and artificial intelligence tool on democratic processes. On a scale from 1 to 10, 1 being the lowest, 10 being the highest, how do you estimate the impact of these technologies to have on democratic institutions and processes? And Tom, I'll just start with you.
Well, so what we've seen over the last couple of years, obviously the democratization of the tech, and now a productization of it into all kinds of sectors that are using it for content generation, especially in media applications across image modalities, audio, language, etc. And this is being used to automate the process of content creation. So this is changing the way that marketing agencies work, advertising agencies, and obviously that feeds into democratic processes as well. It's not actually a new thing. We've had it obviously for a long time, but in the last couple of years it's really accelerated. So in the last couple of years, I mean, I think it's having a huge effect.
And how have you seen the field sort of like changing over the past? So would you say there's been a moment where, say, in let's say the past 2 to 3 years maybe, which was really the the critical juncture in the production of these outputs?
In terms of image models, for sure, the end of 2022, middle to the end of 2022 was the big moment when the models became generalists, the data sets increased in size by an order of magnitude, and they became democratized through things like open source distribution. So access, became ubiquitous, and also the performance and the latency, the performance of the models in terms of the time to generate became tiny. So that's when all of the the ecosystem exploded, and now everyone has access to them basically. So end of 2022 is when it really became like photorealistic in 0 time.
Thank you so much. Gina, same question to you. 1 out of 10, how do you...
Where are we talking about? Are we talking about the UK? Are we talking about the EU? Are we talking about the US? Are we talking about India? When we talk about democratic institutions, we're talking about a wide swath of the globe. We have to remember that elections, in particular, are social, cultural, and political phenomena. They're not just technologies, right? We don't just vote technologically. We want to talk about measuring impact on electorates. We're still waiting to see the measurable impact of our information environments in social media on elections. Now, that's a controversial thing to say, coming from somebody who runs a center called the Center for Technology and Democracy. It's a controversial thing to say for somebody who my day job is fighting the agents of misinformation and disinformation, right? My day job is helping to run the policy wing of a European Union Commission-funded Horizon project, 6.5 million euro investment called AI for Trust, trying to build one of these mis and disinformation tools to counter, an AI tool to counter mis and disinformation powered by human-in-the-loop fact-checking organizations across the EU and multiple EU languages. So when I say we have to think about this in other frameworks, we have to realize that the problems that we're facing with deepfakes, the problems that we're facing with mis and disinformation on our information environment more generally, are not problems that have just a technological solution. So again, it's hard for me to say 1 to 10, but if I'm looking at the US elections, right, which I am very closely, you might be able to hear from the accent, I would worry less in some ways about the deepfake environment and more about the impact of the political discourse that we're having from the very top, from the candidates. If I'm looking at India, I'm less worried about the large social media platforms than I am about the proliferation of smartphone messaging apps like Telegram and WhatsApp, where we're seeing an enormous proliferation, not of deep fakes, but of simple mis and dis in different forms. And then finally, with my UK hat on, here, our center I joined a call that was issued by Demos and others, where we're calling on all parties in the upcoming UK general election to agree a code of conduct on generative AI tools. So when I say that the problems are social, cultural, and political, and maybe technological as well, I think we have solutions. We have tools in our toolbox that we can use to get better behavior, better information in our electorates. So that includes asking the parties to agree to not amplify things that they know might be mis and disinformation, asking the parties to train the people that work with them in these campaigns, and asking the parties to be really clear and transparent if they are using Gen AI tools, why they're using them, having them agree not to use them to mislead people, and if they do put out something that's been used by a Gen AI tool, use a label, be clear. I think it's a sensible way, and it's actually a very British way of approaching these problems. So if I'm looking at the upcoming UK elections, I don't. I think this is not, I think it's going to be a, I don't want to say it's going to be a non-issue because, you know, touch wood, I don't want to be wrong. But I don't think it's as critical here in the UK as it might be in other jurisdictions facing elections.
Interesting. So I think one of the thoughts that immediately pop up to my mind, and this is kind of like a nice segue to my question I had for Ella, is that maybe this is a bit controversial to say, but would you say from a sort of sociological perspective, it's almost like a deepfake in an electoral context is by itself not harmful? The way that we react to them actually is.
Yeah. In fact, with your previous question, I was going to enact a classic sociological move and question the question. Because I think one of the big consequences for democracy is the fact that we're all here tonight thinking about AI and elections. And I think that the fact that we're doing that, and the fact that we're having to react to constant changes in AI innovation, we're constantly trying to figure out what's going on, is taking air from the room of our democracy, right? So one of my concerns is this kind of meta level, like almost like a discourse level of like, what is this discourse about AI and elections? Who benefits from us being worried about it? And what is happening when we pay attention to this and we're not spending our time in our communities, with our families, you know, working for our democracies, et cetera. So I think for me, I am interested in a deepfake in an election, right? But I think it's not that I'm worried that people will be duped. I actually don't think people are very dupable. I am worried that we are so worried about it and we're not spending our energies on other really crucial things that are post-election.
Interesting. Such as, for example?
Well, if we think about, you know, organizing around our communities, if we think about, you know, the state of our environment, if we think about the state of our education systems, any of these things, there's a limited time that we all have to be citizens. And if we're spending a lot of this time worrying about AI, we're not working on those things. And the other thing is, this is a question I ask, again, sociologically, you know, we're very concerned with agency versus structure. So how much are we able to act on our own versus how much are we acted upon by kind of power in the world around us? And I wonder about the repeated effect on a citizenry of being in situations where technology is moving so fast that you can only be reactive, you can't be proactive, you can't have agency, you can't go out and initiate things because you're just scrambling to try to figure out what's going on. We've seen this tactic used politically, where political leaders will, on purpose, confuse their citizenry so that they can, the citizenry spends all the time figuring out what's going on, and the political actor can go ahead with their mission, right? This is happening in this case with AI, but it's not even a political purpose. It's sort of like a profit purpose, and it's a kind of byproduct of that. So that's what I'm worried about, and I want us to take back some space and some air to be able to be citizens more broadly. So I'm glad we're here tonight, but I also think what happens after the election, what happens after this talk, right, this panel.
Interesting. I think one of the interesting points that I'd kind of like to touch upon, and Tom, you here, which I think is great, sort of based on everything that you've heard from both Gina and Ella, sort of mentioning about the issues around, you know, how it differs across countries, the fact that we're not just looking at AI as a threat per se, but we're looking at more like the social dynamics behind it, perhaps. From sort of the perspective of developers and people that actually develop these tools, what do you think are sort of some of the, I don't want to say key principles, because that's kind of like very wishy-washy, but do you feel that there is sort of like the knowledge, the awareness, the sense of responsibility on side of the developers that develop these tools for what's to come and how they can be implemented for better or for worse?
Yeah, I mean, so it's really interesting this discussion because I mean, clearly, you know, we've had to deal with changing levels of like information integrity over the last, you know, since the internet arrived and democratization of news, etc. And you learn, I think, as an individual to take things, you know, with a pinch of salt when you read them, and you kind of look at the sources, and you expect there to be a good provenance of sources, and use that to your advantage to try and understand the integrity of the information. And with AI, clearly, like, this is a different ballgame, right? The outputs are being produced by a machine, and not an individual or an organization. So there are, okay, so basically there are definitely a set of principles which, like I think most big AI companies will go through around things like safety and guardrails, and you know, that there are different ways of doing that in different modalities. For image generation, for instance, you know, it's possible to fine-tune image models on individual likenesses, and so we put in guardrails to stop people doing that on famous faces, but it's very, very difficult to do that. Like, there isn't actually a system that exists that I could implement in a model architecture that would stop it from being able to be fine-tuned on your image, for instance. Mm-hmm. Like, how do I prove that I own the rights to your image to fine-tune on it? So there are guardrails that we can try and put in, but a lot of this is actually like not possible in terms of nth degree. So for sure, though, like right now, the onus is on the AI companies to put in those safety measures, and regulation is starting to catch up with that. There's, you know, lots of different things happening at the moment in different countries, different regulatory environments, and again, they're kind of modality specific, right? So image models are one example. Language models are a completely different one. But it's I think that from talking to, you know, people both in government and you know, in the industry, there's an appetite for or, you know, a demand for governments to get involved and to understand the issues more, and to do that in a way that doesn't stifle innovation but is still pushing forward. And this is, I mean, they're all, you know, the big technologies are working on this. So like Adobe has something called the Adobe CAI, which is the Content Authenticity Initiative, and it allows you to digitally sign images so you can tell the provenance of the models that are actually used to generate the images. But again, these things can be stripped out in like open source environments. So there are limitations on how successful they can be.
So if I can just like play back in my understanding what you've just said about sort of like the possibilities that developers have. We can talk about guardrails, and you're saying there's a conversation about, you know, the AI companies having to put guardrails because policy makers and regulators pressure them to do so. But the possibilities on that to actually make them do something are fairly limited. The emphasis should be more on content provenance. Is that correct?
Content provenance is one thing. Something that's incredibly difficult to solve is bias. This is one of the biggest problems with AI models, right? And everyone's looking at this as a, you know, should there be a regulatory system for monitoring and like exposing bias in models, and no one is able to kind of like, you know, objectively define what bias is in the like human context, let alone apply it to an AI model. So this is where it gets really dangerous, and this is where you have things like the Google Gemini, you know, image mistakes that happened a couple of months ago, because it's very, very, very difficult, if not impossible, to implement the system.
Brilliant. Gina, do you agree?
I mean, to some extent, but, you know, I don't like the framing of saying we have a choice, we have innovation or we have regulation, because it misses out on the extraordinary amount of work and capacity building we have in front of us to get organizations, companies, and workers and citizens ready for the AI tools that we have today. So when I talk to groups, overwhelmingly, I'm hearing from organizations that say, how do I use AI responsibly within my organization? Working with the Bennett Institute and AI at CAM, in October, my team released a report on what should the UK's policy on AI, on Gen AI be. And one of the things we call for in that report is to make sure that we're having these kinds of conversations, so that, not that we're reining in big tech, that may be a goal of my organization, you know, my mission statement, but so that small startups, small medium enterprise companies can build on foundation models and know that they can do so without risking reputational harm, without risking lawsuits for discrimination, without risking IP violations. And future plug, we're going to have a report coming soon on IP and Gen AI, sitting between Mandaru Center for Technology and Democracy and the Bennett Institute and AI at CAM. So, you know, we've got real problems to solve. You can't just say, oh, there's this really cool tech out there, and, you know, I've got a crazy idea. Let's just take Scarlett Johansson's voice. Like, well, why don't we do that? Who in their right mind did that? And then what in their right mind were they thinking that a company attorney signed off on officially asking her. Like, I'm sorry, if you're gonna, what was the line from The Wire? If you're gonna have a criminal conspiracy, are you writing down a criminal conspiracy? That's what OpenAI, as reported today in the New York Times, may have just done. That they have trained the model used on a voice, and then said, oh, by the way, can we use your voice? No, we really, really want to use your voice. We don't live in an IP world in which we use first and ask questions later. And yet these models have been built exactly on that premise. So to say we can have, something harnessing innovation versus regulation, like, we already have laws on the books, can we just follow some of those? So one of the things we did in our center this year was to say, if we take the UK approach, which is a proportionate approach to regulation in generative AI and large language models, saying let's keep the regulation with the existing regulators we have. What does that mean for work? What does that mean for employment law in this country? And it took a group of us sitting together for 9 months, from industry, from civil society, from academia, from unions, to say, how do we make UK employment, just a sliver of UK employment law, fit for purpose in the AI age? And again, it's not straightforward. It's not something that's apparent. We have to write the exam paper in order to actually see the results. So yes, we have technical work to develop these tools, but we also have the social, cultural, political, and yes, legal and regulatory capacities that we have to build in order that other companies can innovate. And until we get those pieces in place, I think we're gonna slow things down.
Interesting. And as far as sort of some of the regulations and policies are concerned with regards to, I guess, information integrity, in light of sort of like the developments that are happening with Gen AI tools, if we sort of contextualize that within elections, let's say within the UK, do you find that the current policies and regulation are sufficient, or is there sort of a major gap in the policy market if we want something that urgently needs to change or adapt? Or
listen, we may be too late on this code of conduct even, right? I mean, something as simple as civil society coming together and saying, please, UK parties, can you just agree not to be bad, at least in using Gen AI? Can you just do what I think most people in the electorate would want to see? That you don't transparently lie to us using these tools. And we may be too late to have that conversation. So I think we do need some agility in terms of our regulatory space, but I think there's some really basic things that we can come together and agree and do. We just need leadership and action to see those.
Interesting. Tom, 1 second, I saw you.
No, yeah,
somewhere. I just have a question for Ella, and then
Yeah.
I'll shift back to you. One question, and that's almost like you mentioned sort of the point about power structures and sort of the fact that people wonder, do I have agency in this kind of like system? And I think it's really interesting what Gina said about sort of like the point that there is sort of an argument or a feeling that we're being transparently being lied to, that is almost a bit obvious in our face even. If we contextualize that again, sort of like, if we look at sort of like democratic processes and like these sort of like overarching dynamics that are above us with these large firms, what do you think is, how do you expect from a sociological perspective society to change? How do you feel like it's sort of like, can we deal with that? And is there some does this have almost like an impact on the political psychology of society as a whole? It's a massive question.
Yeah, it's a great question. I've been thinking about this a lot, and one of the kind of big picture questions I have is, what are we assuming about the way that people make, gain knowledge and make decisions about what the truth is, right? And what are those assumptions that exist within both what we're worried about and the regulations we're making? And there's two assumptions that I think are in some of this sort of positing of the problem and solving of the problem that I want to trouble. The first is, why are we worried about the deepfakes, misinformation, et cetera? It's because we're worried, in part, that we often are not worried about ourselves being duped, but we're worried about everyone else being duped, right? And I think if you look at sort of ways of understanding how audiences receive messages in sociology over time. There's been an arc in our understanding of how audiences work. And there is this idea of the hypodermic syringe model, which was really big in the Cold War. The US really wanted to figure out how this worked. Like, how do you take a message, propaganda, and just kind of inject it into someone and they believe that message, right? However, they never figured that out. It was fully debunked in sociological theory about audiences, which showed that audiences are really complicated, they're really sophisticated. How they interpret something depends on who they're with, who they are, what happened that day, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And what I find so puzzling about this is this kind of return to the hypodermic syringe model, where everyone's worried that people are going to get, you know, faked, and they'll believe that they should go to the election and vote on a different day or in a different place, or, you know. And I think we have to understand that audiences, we are much more complex and sophisticated than that. So worrying about the hypodermic syringe effect is kind of worrying about the wrong thing. And I think, you know, earlier I said I'm worried about people kind of not having time, but also turning away from engaging in public information. But there's another thing I think that the assumption that's within these sort of problematizations and regulations around what's going on with Gen AI in this space, which is this idea that epistemology is static, so our ways of knowing are static. And we actually know that our ways of knowing are multiple and they change over time, right? So, for example, you think of the rise of Enlightenment thinking in the UK, and then suddenly we were thinking about objectivity and the scientific method, right? And then you had the feminist turn in epistemology, which said, actually, you know, as women, we know that there are more than one way of knowing, because the way that the kind of dominant scholarship tells us we should know doesn't fit with our experience. So, you know, and I think one of the things we're seeing now is we are worried that we have this kind of whole seeing as believing epistemology, which I think is a result, really, in part, of social media platforms pushing the visual, right? So like Facebook saying we're going to go video first, et cetera. Suddenly we got used to sort of the seeing as believing epistemology. But I don't think we're going to stay there as individuals and groups. And we might move back to different ways of knowing. So, you know, social verification. I establish if something is true by checking with my friends and my colleagues, or ideas of sort of verifying through your own senses, right? So we have many ways of knowing, and I think the problem with deepfakes is only a problem with one kind of epistemology, which is the kind of seeing as believing epistemology. So anyway, that's some of the bigger issue thinking I've been doing around how we deal with this situation.
No, I think that's fascinating. I like the thought, first of all, that sort of, I'm personally not worried about anyone falling for a deepfake. I'm worried about everyone else, and that's kind of like one mindset that a lot of people have, which I think is I never considered it that way. Seeing is believing, and epistemology, particularly in political context. Does this mean that we have to reassess our understanding of authenticity itself?
I mean, I think we all have different ways of getting there. And I think the way that's being challenged is the dominant kind of Western institutional way of establishing what a truth is, which comes from Enlightenment. But it's like what the media tells us. So it's this who, what, where, when, why kind of way of establishing things, where, you know, it's not necessarily, it may not be a fact if you can't establish when it happened, even though you think it might have happened. You can't use it as a kind of professional fact, right? So I think it's that version that's being challenged. And I think there are some good things about that opening up. There are some bad things about that opening up. It depends. It really is, you know, different groups will bring different ways of knowing, and some of them we like and some of them we don't like. So
interesting. I mean, my naive side kind of feels like, okay, then maybe it means that political rhetoric itself and presentation is less important. The policy substance matters, but I'm not sure. I'm not quite sure whether that's going to take place. But I think you're precisely right. Sort of the seeing is believing, the idea of epistemological understandings and paradigm shifting is, I think, kind of one of the things that is really spot on. And I think we'll be discussing that in the next panel. Tom, I saw you earlier reacting sort of...
No, well, I think this isn't the first time we've had elections, and you know, there have been efforts for like misinformation, and you know, it was slightly different, but it was the result of a change in what was possible with technology. So if you look back at the previous US elections and the Cambridge Analytica scandal and all of this is basically using like social media and like social engineering through technology to try and influence. And I think certainly for me personally, like growing up with the internet, I think there's been like a change in my brain around how I perceive and dissect information. And certainly, if I look at my kids, this is happening as well. They're just there's like this kind of permanent stream of inbound information. You have to learn how to dissect that and change it. And I'm also, the last thing I was going to say, I'm not sure that the danger from generative AI in elections is actually from organisations that can be regulated. It's probably going to be from like rogue actors, that may have some other secondary or indirect reason to be changing what people are seeing. So the combination of those things, obviously regulation is hugely important, but it's not necessarily where the dangers are going to come from.
Interesting. Yes, Yoda.
Yeah, just on rogue actors, right? The threat model is not the threat model that we think it is, right? The idea of the threat model being a rogue actor will be on one side versus the other, right? What rogue actors, so we just today, the evidence to the Joint Committee on National Security Strategy was published. Our organization, along with many others, including the big tech companies, have had their evidence published online. And the threats from foreign actors to elections are about something that I think is much deeper than trying to change the debate on one side or another. The best research we have from social media data right now shows very limited action coming out of social media exposure. Now, as someone who advocates for better social media controls, I don't like that fact. And I think that might be not right wearing my research hat. But right now, we do not have the high quality evidence that says people seeing things on social media change what we think in elections. But we do have the slow chipping away at the democratic institutions and social arrangements and configurations. So I'll make a plug for Who Trolled Amber, the podcast from Tortoise Media on Amber Heard that's just been listed as one of the best podcasts ever. I'm going to be talking with the journalist Alexi Mostras next month about this, and Amber Heard's lawyer. I mean, we there see an organized, coordinated, inauthentic campaign about something most people in this room don't care about. And yet it chips away ever so slightly at our sense of reality. So I think the idea that we say there'll be a threat actor in an election and they'll support one party over another party or one candidate over another party isn't quite how they're seeing their theory of change. Their theory of change is let's destabilize that country over there. And that's the thing we should worry about. And I think that's where we probably see closer to eye on this one, right? That, the idea that there'll be a deep fake that will somehow turn the electorate in a democratic country one way or another, I'm less worried than that, than this kind of approach that says, let's slowly chip away at the sense of what is right and wrong in a particular place.
Yeah. Well, it does seem almost like, it seems hard to imagine that I'm going to see a deep fake of Joe Biden and now I'm going to vote for Trump, right? Or the other way around. It's kind of unlikely. It seems more like that there is and that's probably coming back to Ella's point about almost like an epistemological threat that ultimately undermines our trust in democratic processes and institutions. And as a result, why show up if I cannot trust anyone or anything, almost, right? Are there some questions from the audience? We have a little bit of time for you guys to ask some questions for our speakers. Please just raise your hand. I have a ton more questions, so.
If nobody asks, I will ask.
Yes, sir.
I mean, compare US and you said about US and the UK. They are very different. US is number of people taking part in an election is growing, whereas in UK is going down. Therefore, what's the AI role in it? Why in UK is going down and US going up number of people taking part?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is one of those important social, cultural, political aspects, and not necessarily technological one. I mean, the challenge I think around foreign manipulation of information environments around elections is that, as we were saying, is getting people desensitized and depressing voter turnout. And that's hard in a case where, voter turnout is not where it is. I think there's a real opportunity in this country to have the conversation about why people should care about voting and using AI in our information environment to have and spark those conversations. I would love to see the political parties take that on as a way to, to spark that enthusiasm around the elections. I'm not going to hold my breath that it happens. In the US, I think there's something else, in the presidential elections, something else that happens. But just note, right, the US presidential elections are the most expensive elections in the world. And they form a global consultancy circuit. So the campaign teams, the political teams who run US presidential campaigns, they work the US, that's where they make their money, and then they can take and innovate from those elections into other jurisdictions. So in some ways, the UK will benefit from the lack of space between the general election here and the US election. I don't think you're going to, the timing is such that we're unlikely to see a big shift of energy and attention from the US, from the cash-rich US market, where they're innovating for good or bad in technology development and elections coming into the UK. So I do think we have in the UK a real opportunity to say, this is how we should be doing elections in democracies. I think that's something we can call on the parties to stand up for.
Just add on, do you feel the US is more freedom compared to UK, being open society?
Both countries love to talk about how they have democratic values, don't they? I was at a swearing-in ceremony yesterday for a new British citizen, and I was literally moved to tears. I will say, I was so moved to tears by, we believe in democratic values and freedom of speech. I think the same rhetoric happens in the United States, and it's really, I loved Ella's points. It's up to making sure that people exercise those democratic values, that we can really also be inspired by them.
Just coming back to the elections, you seem to be relying somewhat on politicians agreeing to not lie. And I was at Ofcom at the time of the Brexit referendum, looking at what people were saying, and of course people lied. So I do think we come back to this challenge. They've always lied, they always will lie. They've now got better tools for lying. What would you do as a regulator if you're sitting in regulator responsible for a personal election? You don't want to stop people. You can't tell people what truth is, because that's not the job of a regulator or government. But you need to find some way of allowing different viewpoints to come out.
I want to just echo what Tom said earlier, which is some of these actors aren't going to be held under UK regulation, right? So let's just call it what it is: foreign manipulated information that can now easily seep into our information environments. That's something else. Let's push that to the side. What can regulators do? I actually think this call to action is a framework for what regulated speech can be. You don't want to regulate speech, and you don't want to regulate what is true. But you can say, these particular tools, if you use them in this way, you should label them and be transparent about that. That's, I think, it's harder as certain kinds of Gen AI tools are used and integrated into the suite of services that we have. But I think that's a starting place, right? And you're right, you can't force people to act with these extremely high principles, but I think we can stand up for what good elections look like. And I think the UK has an extraordinarily important role to play in the world at a time when, democratic values are shifting. We've work to do globally, I think.
have something to add to that. So I was looking a bit at the, what's going on in the U.S. around AI regulation, where there's an innovation framework, and then the EU, where there's a harms and risks framework. And I was thinking about it, and I was sort of bringing it home to discussions I've had at the university about Gen AI in student assessment, right? And I think I had this kind of metaphor moment where I suddenly saw regulation much more clearly because of what's happening at the university, which is, in my School of Humanities and Social Sciences, we have a manifesto that I co-wrote, which says that, we should avoid the use of Gen AI in scholarship because it stops, gets in the way of education. Ethically, it's very political and compromising, and it eliminates those eureka moments, right, of the joy of scholarship. And so I was talking with our awesome and wonderful student rep, and he said, well, look, I've been talking to students about this, and they agree. They really agree with this manifesto. They agree with the principles in theory, but in practice. And I think this is actually a tragedy of the commons situation, where regulation is, like, the only way out of tragedy of the commons is actually regulation. So these students, some of these students are saying, well, look, I know, but like individually, if I think everyone else is using it, if I think you can't detect it very well, and if it saves me a lot of time, why wouldn't I use it? Even I don't want to use it. Morally, I don't want to use it, but why wouldn't I use it, right? And so the students are actually saying, can you, for example, can we go back to handwritten exams because no one can use Gen AI? You take away our moral dilemma, right? And I was thinking about that in a regulation, comparison to regulation, and I think that's what regulation is for. It's for making those, it's for taking away the moral dilemmas where, I can imagine that there's a lot of political actors who are like, oh, I don't want to use deepfakes, but if everyone else is using deepfakes, I'm going to use deepfakes, right? So regulation, even though obviously doesn't deal with, these sort of malevolent, external actors, et cetera, but if it at least provides a framework that people can use to sort of make the decision easier not to use it, right? And to do the right thing for the commons, I think that's a really good thing.
We have about, okay, yeah, you sir, just one more question. We have 2 more minutes.
Perfect, we're in 2 minutes. But Dr. McFerson, you mentioned that our epistemology is changing and almost suggests that it's not necessarily a bad development, but it strikes me that the sort of Enlightenment-inspired epistemology we had before is what best suits in upholding our democratic structures as we understand them now. So I'd love if you could kind of elaborate a bit on that, and more concretely, what are the implications of that changing epistemology?
Sure. So I think Enlightenment kind of epistemologies make democracy work for certain groups, right? For groups who sort of see themselves in these epistemologies and benefit from them. And I think there's other groups who've always felt excluded by these ways of knowing and haven't felt like they've participated in democracies. So I think if you look at, for example, the rise of the alt-right in the US, I mean, one of the driving forces there is the feeling of not belonging to this system. Like this way of knowing these democratic institutions, they don't represent me, they don't even see me, and they certainly don't understand me. And so I think, and this is to the point of, opening up epistemologies and our democratic institutions. We let in good people that okay, then you have to make a moral judgment. Like there are people, groups I like, and I want to have more voice, and there are groups that I think are very dangerous. You can't choose one or the other. They both will get more voice, right? So it's tricky and it's destabilizing, and that makes people very anxious. I think we're in this moment of, in SCS you call it a knowledge controversy, where our ways of knowing and being in democracy are really rapidly changing. There's a power struggle. And these tend to always close again. So we will end up in a new form of stability, which I hope is a more open form of stability, but we don't know yet, right? We don't know.
All right, well, I'm afraid we're out of time, but it's really been a fascinating discussion. So thank you so much for joining me, everyone. Okay, brilliant. So now that we have talked about sort of like the big picture, the regulatory environment, perhaps some of the policies that need to be put in place, and not least this change of epistemology that is unfolding, I think one of the key things when it comes to the use of AI in elections, or the impact of AI in elections, is of course the role that media plays. Media as sort of like a catalyst and sort of the channel through which we absorb information, through which we many times educate ourselves. Not least also media as sort of one of the main actors that has been sort of like changing perhaps a little bit, that has been We found new appreciation has been under attack even at some point from new kinds of actors that are emerging. So this is something that I think is going to be really important to address. And for this conversation, I'm actually really pleased to be welcoming on stage, first of all, Kenneth Cukier, who is the Deputy Executive Editor at The Economist, Dr. Kerry McInerney, who is a Research Associate at the Leverhulme Center for the Future of Intelligence, as well as Henry Eider, who is a founder of Latent Space. Thank you very much. Okay, so let's start with one simple question as well, just like that. I would like to ask everyone here involved. Gen AI tools more broadly. To what extent do they transform our understanding of knowledge integrity? Carry on, start.
I realized I sat in the hot seat. I was like, oh no, I should have sat there. I mean, I think the previous panel has raised so many fascinating and important insights around the threat that these tools posing, not necessarily being that they mislead inherently, but how they more broadly shape our knowledge environment. And so I think one of the reasons why we see so much concern about AI and deepfakes and misinformation right now, I think, is because of this much longer arc, or this much longer conversation we've been having about the idea of a post-truth era, the idea that people now don't trust a lot of conventional media sources. But I also think it's really important to contextualize that in the broader economic context of the sustained, often systematic dismantling of various forms of public media funding, and also the kind of rise of this attention economy, where there's this increased commercial model of generating income through clicks. And so I think this is kind of almost a perfect storm that's brought us to this question of media integrity. But I think while the focus on misinformation in elections matters, I think it's important that we zoom out and we contextualize it more broadly, and that's something I hope that we can do on this panel for sure.
Okay.
Repeat the question again, so I have it exactly right.
To what extent do sort of some of these Gen AI tools and overall the rise of artificial intelligence question our current understanding of information integrity?
Okay, so it presumes that we have an understanding of information integrity.
Yeah, right.
Okay. So I don't need to be a Jesuit about it, or rather, a sociologist. And I also think it's incredibly new. Right, I mean, the cliche alert, what do you think of the French Revolution? Or the exchange that was apocryphal between Kissinger and Li Peng. What do you think of the French Revolution? It's too early to tell. We're really in the midst of something new, and it's not quite clear what the impact will be. So let's parse it a little bit more closely on both sides of the equation. And the previous panel, I think, made it a slam dunk, right? Which is, if we think that people are inherently gullible and information actually shifts their beliefs, then if you seed in incorrect information, in theory it should shift their beliefs. But what we do know is that when it comes to political decision making, many people are very hard and fast in their beliefs already, that it's almost impossible to imagine. In fact, we query it in public opinion surveys. What would it take for you to change your view if you're pro-Trump and to Biden or Biden and Trump? And it's almost nothing, right? There's literally almost nothing that would have them shift their vote from one to another. However, the chipping away effect, that sort of the water torture, drop by drop, that seeds doubt not in any one piece of information, but in information in its totality. The very idea of a world in which there are facts in media, that the information is reliable versus unreliable. If you lose that, then it's not that you change their opinion from one thing to another, but you've seeded, or you've sort of, maybe seeded is the right word, a level of apathy and passivity. Hannah Arendt said that totalitarianism wasn't about trying to say that this is true versus untrue. It's about questioning the very nature that there is truth. And so there, I think, is where we should focus our attention, which is an epistemological question. Are we in a world in which, in terms of media integrity, that there's an information commons or a public sphere in which we think that there is truth and that there are sources that we treat to be reliable. Because there was never a halcyon day in which there was, that we had faith in media that didn't exist. If you go back into the early part of the American experience in the 1700s, some of the founding fathers themselves were spreading the most disinformation. John Adams and Benjamin Franklin, most notoriously. We can talk about that later. But then, still, when it came into the 1990s, there was National Enquirer, who famously had on its front page the 14 members of Congress that were space aliens. So, not only was that true, but there was many people in the House, those particular congressmen, admitted to the American people that they indeed were space aliens, playing up on the joke. So, but the point is that was the press. That was journalism too, right? In fact, National Enquirer has been in the news recently because of how they interacted with the 2016 election. So I do think that we don't have media integrity is always going to be shifting, and it's too early to tell what it's going to mean. I would definitely not look at one item that is fake as somehow interfering with the election and changing public opinion. But I would think that if we're in an environment in which many things, and we're talking about at AI scale, that there's just, it's unhygienic from an informational standpoint. It's non-potable information, if you will, like non-potable water, then we have a serious problem.
Interesting, fascinating. Thank you so much, Ken. Henry, I wanted to touch upon sort of one of the points that Carrie mentioned, and that's sort of like the general environment when it comes to media wanting to follow sort of clicks, wanting to generate engagement, wanting to sort of report on issues that are sort of that generate a lot of traction. And I always feel like there's sort of a lot of journalists that are just waiting there to debunking the next sort of deepfake that was produced about a political candidate. I know that you have a very strong sort of media presence. You interact regularly on broadcast as well as sort of different kinds of newspapers and outlets. Do you find that this is sort of at the moment the case? Have you seen this changing over the past years, or?
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess very briefly, if I may, just before answering that, just on the initial one around information integrity, I kind of echo this sense that I think most people don't really understand kind of how the media they are consuming every day has been shaped. Whether that's this idea of a no-filter image, which if you look at 20 different smartphones, a computational photography running each of those smartphones will be shaping that image differently, whether that's kind of classic movie magic in the way that films are made, in kind of commercial photography, sound design, all of these different things. Our world is already inherently very synthetic pre the kind of Gen AI boom. And I think this idea that people are now saying oh my gosh, everything could be fabricated or synthetically shaped or generated, I think points precisely to some of the naivety we might have had already about how synthetic our world already is, albeit through different means, and there's issues of scalability and accessibility to the tool sets, as well as some things like, for example, real-time voice cloning, which just weren't feasible previously. But I do think that, there's a bit of naivety. It's kind of the Gen AI boom at the moment, and deepfake boom, it's a bit of a looking glass to, well, actually, the world was already kind of quite shaped and synthetic. That's what media does, right? It's mediate. But in the question of the media itself, it's a really good one. Insofar as, this obviously is a talk about elections, and having worked in this space, particularly on the issue of deepfakes since 2018, I've had journalists before every midterm presidential election in the US, pretty much, kind of saying, is this going to be the one that deepfakes cause chaos? We've seen this one case of an AI-generated profile picture on an account making a fake tweet about Trump, therefore deepfakes are here and they're causing chaos. So far, it's not really been the case, and even now, we're seeing a high volume of this kind of content circulating, but the jury is still very much out about the actual persuasive impact. So it's no longer a question of are deepfakes and generative AI-generated outputs going to be used in the electoral context or in kind of these quite sensational contexts. It's how effective they're going to be. So far, the research is limited, and the kind of bite has not really matched the bark. But I think you're right that the media has a role to play in trying to shape a more nuanced narrative. And as it stands so far, exactly as you said, every time there is a deepfake that comes out, even if it was that Biden robocall that we saw in New Hampshire earlier this year, it wasn't particularly convincing, it wasn't particularly well executed, and yet the way it was reported built a lot of fear. I think it built quite a lot of concern, which I think has some use, particularly if you're trying to get politicians, stakeholders in government to kind of step up and pay a bit more attention. That can be useful, but for the general public, and I think we'll come to this later in this discussion, there is a real challenge of explainability around how these tools work and also sufficient conditions for truthfulness or trust. And I don't think at the moment the media are doing a fantastic job on the whole of navigating the nuance.
Carrie, sorry, you were about to.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I completely agree with this idea of like, I worry that this focus on AI, misinformation, elections, even though I know we're all agreed to be here, we think it's really important, does have this knock-on effect of like, what does this do again to how people engage with news media? And I also just think that the narrow focus on misinformation specifically maybe aligns in ways that AI can so much more broadly affect, as the last panel was saying, our democratic institutions, but also just like simply who gets to participate in public space and democratic space and who doesn't. Like, I'm personally much more concerned about the use of deepfake technology to harass and abuse female politicians, for example, or female journalists, or groups that we know already experience huge outsized amounts of online abuse. And that, I think, seriously impacts the broad, expansive equality of our democracies. But that, I think, is an issue that doesn't get nearly as much attention, say, as like Joe Biden making kind of a phone call to someone. And so, I hope that as we have this conversation as well, like these kinds of issues or how these technologies interact with the inequalities that already exist in our democratic processes will come to the fore.
Interesting. Would it be fair to say, and that's just to play a bit devil's advocate, that even the threat actors themselves are still figuring out how to use them to create the most amount of damage, in your opinion?
I mean, I think this idea of the threat actor itself is really complicated, and I say that again as someone who, I don't want to underplay at all the fact that I'm sure there are many people who would see these technologies and meaningfully want to create harm with them. But I also think that there's, a lot of complexities when it comes to, why people might use AI to either proliferate forms of information or misinformation, or simply to try and garner voter support. Because I think a lot of the applications we're seeing of AI in elections, we've seen this, I think, in India and Pakistan, have been less about creating misinformation per se and more about just trying to increase voter engagement. And so, so I worry a little bit sometimes that we focus on the threat model, that, on the one hand, it maybe only captures a sliver of it. And then second, again, coming back to that question of gender-based violence and abuse that I just raised, I think the threat model in a lot of political theory, IR, and cybersecurity is often, I would say, like quite highly masculinist in its model, or we see this a lot with other kinds of tech development, like smart home technologies. They're often created to say, okay, well, how do we ensure that my Amazon Alexa isn't hacked by someone outside the home? Maybe people haven't thought about how someone inside the home could use that for intimate partner abuse or to control someone in their home. And so I think we can see like a similar logic playing out when it comes to AI and election technology, which is, yes, we might be thinking a lot about the kind of foreign actor, the external threat, but there's a lot of other ways that tools can be manipulated and exploited and used that can be really deeply harmful. And so it's important to, zoom out on this conversation. And Henry, I know this is something you've done a lot of work on.
Yeah, as I say, I think it's a really good point around the threat actor ambiguity, and specific to the election context back in 2021, I think it was. It feels like a long time ago, even though it wasn't that long, given this time, the speed at which this space is moving. But I wrote a report called Just Joking with MIT and the human rights organization Witness, who have been doing a huge amount of work in this space for a number of years now. And this was looking specifically at the use of satire deepfakes and satire in the political sphere. And there are different ways that this manifests, but broadly speaking, a lot of the satire using deepfakes is good faith, or at least it's a form of critical speech I think we would all agree we'd like to protect. But there is cases of clumsy satire, i.e. someone not executing it, in a way that's clearly fake or has some kind of disclosure, transparency marking, or bad actors weaponizing the idea of satire and using it both as a sword and a shield, right? Using it as a sword to mislead, and once people say, hey, what are you doing? That's clearly fake, you're trying to mislead people, they say, you didn't get the joke, bro, like me, didn't get it. We've seen, particularly on the right wing, around the world, this being deployed quite extensively, but also on the left. We've seen it with Keir Starmer. We saw some cases where people were creating deepfakes of him abusing voice audio, leaked recording, a classic model that we're starting to see emerging, which is probably the most potent. But of him berating an assistant, swearing at him, calling him an idiot, a moron. The guy who leaked it, shared this, was claiming it was satirical, but it was released in a way where it was also clearly meant to be deceptive. It was being framed in a certain way and was kind of toying with people who were disagreeing. So I think you're absolutely right. The threat actor model is complex. It depends on who you're talking to. It's not that easy to define kind of essentially in that way. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Ken, a question to you, and working at The Economist, and that's sort of like a question sort of on traditional media before I go into sort of the whole social media space. How do you feel should like traditional media outlets such as like journals collaborate potentially with some of the initiatives such as C2PA or some of the authenticity initiatives? What are sort of like the ways that you think traditional media is engaging, should be engaging, could be engaging potentially?
So a lot of groups do come to us and ask us to be a part of their consortium and things like that. For many news organizations, I think it's the right thing to do to get involved with it and to sort of almost just sort of safety in numbers and just to be a part of it, just for the being part of the information flow back and forth. We sometimes agree to be a part of some of these, but we rather don't, right? We prefer to be independent in every single way, but I think that makes us an outlier in some respects, and we've always valued that purity of independence by not being involved in things. We don't adhere to a political party, which was really important because, of course, the Tories and the Whigs changed sides throughout the last 180 years. Now I think we've always been staunchly on the right, and now with the right wing having been lost its orbit, many people would see us as sort of part and parcel of the Democratic Party in the United States, which is a strange position for us. So that independence has been quite vital to us. So we take a step back and we take a look. Nevertheless, you wonder, well, how should traditional media interact with AI researchers and consortia who are taking a role in terms of trying to clean up the information commons? It depends on what they're doing. If it's something, I guess, related to media in which we're developing the tools so that we can verify and validate information as authentic, that sounds very good. But to go beyond that, I think it's really risky to be affiliated with a particular organization rather than to maintain your independence. You could report on them, you could acquire their tools, it might be royalty free or it might be for money, to actually use it, and you can learn from it. But I think you want to still be separate from it. But that's for private sector media. And also, we don't have the resources to be the fact checker for the global information commons. Some organizations try to do that. Wire agencies, for example, are extraordinarily probate in what they put through the wires because it's sort of the atomic unit of media. At The Economist, we have fact checkers as well. Not many news organizations do. So we have an entire team of people that everything that we published has gone through typically about 8 different layers of editing, including an entire fact-checking team that has looked at every single sentence, every single word, and seen what the source is, and validating it, preventing errors to go through. But we're commenting on the news. We do report the news, but it's not at that atomic level of information, right? So if something's in the air, we report about that it's in the air, rather than being the ones to authenticate it. Who will be and if it's not 100% rock solidly true, we either don't report it or we disclose the fact that is according to human rights groups, this many people have been killed. We disclose the limits of our confidence in that information. Where you could imagine media playing that role of adjudicating fact, reality, is with the public service broadcasters. Absolutely radioactive to say this, because it hopefully would not politicize them, but they do have the resources, they have the remit, they have a tie to officialdom, but they've got processes that makes them independent of the state and of officialdom. And in the case of Europe, all European countries have them, and they have the European Broadcasting Union as well that can sort of rally them and corral them. So that's where I see a role for, if you will, media being the adjudicator of information.
Interesting. I guess there's probably two points there that I think are interesting to raise, and Carrie, that's sort of one to use. You mentioned there is sort of like an element of demographics, of people being included, some other being excluded. Can you sort of like show us how The Economist is very rigorous on sort of like the fact checking? There's a lot of editing. There's a lot of there's a really rigorous process that the journal goes through in order to provide the sort of quality. And let's say, I'm after this conversation, I don't even dare to say truthfulness, but it's sort of like you know what, I guess you know what I mean. But I think there's almost two elements there I think are interesting. One is the fact that not everyone can afford newspapers that are rigorous across the world. Secondly, there's probably an educational element there because it's very analytical, it's very rigorous, written accessibly. And then there's probably a demographic one in terms of like the younger people who are mostly on TikTok and get their information from there. And to you, Kerry, I was wondering, all these factors, particularly relating on some level to accessibility, how do you think does that influence how people absorb their information, political information specifically, I would assume?
I thought you gave me the side eye when you said TikTok, and I thought, I want to know how much time I spend on TikTok. It's frightening. Yeah, I mean, I think these questions of access and communication are really, really important, but I think it also raises this bigger question of, again, like platform companies and economies, and thinking about not only how do people access information in terms of how it's tailored to them, but also who becomes the gatekeeper and the arbitrator of our civil liberties. And to some extent, you know, again, I don't want to undermine the work that, say, people at Google or Meta are doing when it comes to trying to create safer, better information environments. I know people who work in those roles. It's horrible and complicated work. But at the same time, like, I am worried that, you know, ultimately the people who are becoming the main gatekeepers of, you know, information about our politics and our societies and our democracies are starting to become people who sit in big tech firms. And that is concerning to me. And I think that really matters when we think about accessibility, not just in terms of, you know, what information is made legible to certain audiences, but also, like, again, who gets to participate in public spaces on platforms, what kinds of information proliferates. And I think this is where, like, we have to think about AI and misinformation in the context of things like shadow banning, for example, so simply removing certain posters from platforms. And also in terms of, again, like, what kinds of political movements manage to proliferate on certain kinds of social media spaces. So I co-chair a research stream at the Liebhume Center called The Global Politics of AI, and largely what that stream is really interested in is how AI impacts international relations. So sometimes that looks like the geopolitical struggles over, say, AI supply chains, say, between US and China, but a lot of the time it looks a little bit more mundanely about how these technologies are being taken up across the world. And I think something that is really striking when you look at these different cases is that for, say, us based in the UK, we're treating these platforms as one source of information, but we have a wide plethora of choices with the different kinds of platforms we could use. We could use TikTok, we could look at The Economist, but in other countries, there are certain platforms, I'm thinking of Bennett, for example, in the case of Myanmar, where, you know, that platform is almost providing all the internet structure in that place. And so Amnesty International did some reporting on the Rohingya genocide in Myanmar, and specifically looking at Meta's role in that, and they were arguing that Meta had an outsized responsibility there because in Myanmar, you know, this is a country where Facebook is basically the internet, or it's where people are getting a huge amount of their information and internet access from. So that's a very long way of not really answering your question about making information accessible to different groups, but again, kind of zooming out to be like, who has the power to be the gatekeepers of making certain information available and certain information invisible?
No, I think that's great, and I guess the main point that I'm hearing here is that on a global level, there are just like nuances, right, and different kinds of strata that need tackling. So you might have some parts of the world that are, like also India, I think, like most of internet access is provided by Facebook, and whereas, you know, the way that people absorb information, the platforms that they use varies and differs based on their demographic group, their age, their economic means. I guess that does bring us a little bit to sort of like the initiatives, and I think the policy mechanisms that can be put in place to actually support some of this let's call it like the total, to protect us from sort of like a real erosion from truthfulness. Henry, I guess you have you will have some thoughts about sort of like how we can secure authenticity, provenance of content. Is this whole thing about, you know, we develop a tool that detects a deep fake, is that a realistic outlook?
No. Next.
Great.
No.
The answer is
so I think what might be useful to do, and I think this is partially because I see a lot of confusion around this, is to kind of maybe just give a very brief overview of the different kinds of approaches that people are looking at. So detection is very much a bottom-down scan. This is taking a piece of media, running it through some kind of neural network, essentially, which is looking to try and identify signals within that piece of media, which are the equivalent of digital fingerprints, artifacts that maybe are not visible to the human eye or ear, but are to these models. So that's one approach, detection. You also then have disclosure, and you have different kinds of disclosure. So you might have heard the phrase watermarking being used quite a lot at the moment, but it's used in quite a vague way. It's not really clear what it's referring to. It can refer to different things. So you can have direct forms of disclosure or watermarking. That's the kind of pre-roll disclaimer. That's the kind of Getty Images sort of translucent logo. That could be an audio warning, something like this. Then you also have indirect forms of disclosure. And this is like injecting good faith red flags into your media, a bit like Google DeepMind's recent Synth ID technology, which essentially makes it really easy for a detector to pick up on those signals. So they're not, again, visible to the human eye, but they are there acting as kind of landmarks or markers to be able to be picked up on. And then you have content provenance-based approaches, which typically use cryptography to secure a form of metadata to a piece of media. At the moment, it's either organically captured on a device or AI generated. And that then travels with that piece of media and allows you to understand how it's been manipulated, how it's been changed over time, but still, so maybe who took it originally, what time, what device it was captured on. So that's kind of the broad array of different approaches that we are looking at technologically. When it comes to detection, this is the one that I think that people have been seeing as the most promising. And it's the most alluring for good reason, because we love the idea of kind of like having this godlike technology that can give us this binary yes or no answer. I worked for one of the first deepfake detection startups back in 2019, and let's just say it was a really challenging challenge or problem to deal with. And for a couple of reasons that's the case. One is that the landscape of new generation tools is changing all the time. So you're constantly trying to train your system in a landscape where there are new techniques, new models, new architectures coming out, which are, you don't know if you've got them, if you can cover them. You also have the problem these models really shouldn't be giving you binary yes or no answers when it comes to detection. They use probabilistic reasoning, so it should be a percentage confidence score. And that's not necessarily what people want, right? If you go on social media right now and you look at some of the deepfake detection results which are being publicly shared, people are wanting answers. They want, well, like, what is it? Is it real or is it not? Just tell me. And they want a model to do that for them. So you have a model which can't necessarily be reliable over time, which can be tricked adversarially, i.e. people trying to break it, or just by the natural evolution of the landscape of generative technologies. And then you have the social elements, which I think comes back to from Ella's points, around kind of how people think about what true conditions are. And the temptation is always going to be to over-trust or put more trust in detection than I think we should. The other challenge is that there is no one detection system to rule them all. There are many different private entities out there now, as well as academic entities, all building detection systems, all trying to sell them onto the market as the best, the one government should use, the ones that police should use, the ones that law enforcement should use. And we've seen cases where detection on a piece of suspicious media has given 5 different results across 5 different detection tools. Which one do you trust? Which one do you say, yep, I'm running with that? Or is it more inevitable, as the BBC decided to take the route on this story, to basically just say the jury's out? In a court of law, if there's a piece of evidence which has been submitted of someone committing an act of murder, let's say, which could potentially, put them in jail for the rest of their life, are you going to be comfortable relying on an automated detection system which has poor explainability to make that decision? So I'm quite pessimistic about detection. I think the other approach is a bit more promising. It has a role to play, but it has to be bounded and understood. And at the moment, we don't have many people who understand its limitations.
No, I think can I add to that really fast, because I think it's really interesting hearing it laid out like that. And I also wanted to add as well why I think that skepticism is really important is that I also think there's just a lot of cases where we can know that a media is a deepfake and it still has had its negative effects. And I think, again, intimate image abuse and pornographic deepfakes is a really good example of, I think pretty much everyone probably who looked at the images of Taylor Swift would have been like, we know that this is a deepfake. but the harm's already happened to her and her image and to her, the personal suffering that causes. And so I think, again, when people are really, really excited about this idea of, like you said, the omnipotent kind of godlike detection tool, I think that doesn't always necessarily look, as Gina was saying, the political, the social, the economic impact that deepfake media can have, even if we know it's not true.
I couldn't agree more.
Questions from the audience. We have about, I think, 7 minutes for you, sir.
Thanks. Well, I work in politics, I suppose. Asking for a friend. I guess observation and then a question. So the observation is we're talking about sort of elections, and actually I think the discussion so far has been about the citizens and the electorate on the whole, but actually it's a tiny number of swing voters who could potentially determine outcomes. I was just wondering what do we know about them and their propensity towards deepfakes and misinformation, or is that even the right question? So one question there. The second is just, so obviously the traditional wisdom when somebody would say something negative is you ignore it and you don't give the story oxygen. If a deepfake comes out now, what is good practice? And we've spoken earlier about declining trust in institutions and politics and traditional media. So how does one combat this effectively?
I'd love to jump in. I think very quickly on the first point, I think voter suppression is more worrying to me than perhaps trying to change swing votes, in my opinion. That's my personal perspective. On the second question, this is one that I'm interfacing with quite a lot at the moment, which is I often get news organisations reaching out to me saying, hey, what do you think of this image? What do you think of this piece of audio? I'm not an academically trained digital forensic expert. They exist, but I can count them on both my hands how many of them I actually know. They're a very rare breed. We need a lot more of them. But we're dealing with this situation now where large media organisations, which I won't name, are, excuse my language, they're shitting themselves. Because they are getting images, they're getting pieces of media presented to them. They do not have the requisite skills as individuals to make kind of quick judgments about the authenticity of a piece of media. As I mentioned, detection is not reliable. And so you have this really difficult problem where the responsible thing to do might be to kind of hold off and maybe say this is unconfirmed. But that then leaves a vacuum for the likes of people on TikTok, on other platforms, who perhaps have less scrupulous, as I would say, to then kind of run with that, to build into that vacuum their own narratives. This is a problem. I'm sad to say I don't know what the answer is to that issue at the moment, apart from perhaps a future where we see provenance-based technologies as the default for trust. And that's a long-term project with a lot of hurdles and some downsides. But in my view, we are in kind of the worst moment right now with this problem. I hope we can get out of it using other technological approaches, but it's bad. Yeah.
Someone else who would like to answer.
It's interesting. Walter, one of your questions you asked about the traditional media, and I was almost going to guffaw and say, well, it doesn't exist anymore, right? The mediascape is so different. So the point about a deep fake sort of revealing itself and then the media reporting on it, giving the news oxygen where before it would have been deliberately pushed back. In a kinder, gentler era of media, when there was in the United States in the 80s and 90s a suicide or a drug doctoring scale, like the Tylenol scale, the media, there was sort of a tacit agreement among media companies, I should say platforms, not to report it, but in a very matter-of-fact way and not give extra oxygen to the news so that you would prevent copycat crimes or copycat suicides. And that day is gone, right? You can't really, now you've got much fewer people that you can bring into the room, but you don't bring them, there's no institutions to bring them into the room anymore. They probably would listen to it, it wouldn't matter because people are not getting their news from traditional media. Who reads the Telegraph and the Economist versus going on TikTok and getting their news for free? So I fear that we're in an environment where the deep fake and also the media is more superficial and I would argue today, and it's brutally competitive, and so therefore they would have all the incentives to write about the deep fake rather than to minimize it. So I think that's the world we're in, and we just have to accept that that's what's going to happen. It's definitely going to benefit the oppressor, not the oppressed, to use that political science language, insofar as all you need now to do if you're the Russian government is just to put out a piece of information and hope it gets picked up somewhere, and then everyone else is going to talk about it. You don't even need to get it onto those platforms. Just the dint of it existing may indeed have the fans framed by the institutions of media itself.
I mean, if I can add to that really quickly, I think I agree that the incentives are stacked in one way, and I think that it is possible to swing it the other way, but it requires a huge amount of political will. And I think, for example, we've seen examples, I think, recently of certain media landscapes or organizations choosing not to publicize. I'm from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and after the terror attacks in Christchurch, the New Zealand media kind of put a blanket blackout on saying the killer's name, and that was like a very intentional act in order to not draw more attention to this person and to kind of, further feed their like white supremacist ideology. And on the one hand, I found that very encouraging, but on the other hand, I also think it relied on this very distinct kind of political and media environment, which I don't know if that would translate into another context. Interestingly, I was hosting a panel a couple of weeks ago, and apparently there was a deepfake of the Mayor of London that circulated that then a lot of the media organizations chose, again, intentionally not to circulate on the basis that it was known that it was a deepfake, so they said, look, we just need to not draw further attention to it. So I think it's interesting that we're starting to see like whispers of that, but I agree, like the wider context is so stacked in the other direction of attention, clicks, monetization, that it requires so much will, I think, to make that kind of blackout happen.
Interesting. But I have one thought or a question maybe, and this might be literally totally like missing the mark, but like literally light years. But is there potentially a point about desensitization that people need to have on social spaces? And I'm saying this, my social media feed is full of AI-generated synthetic media, full. And I'm saying like accounts of random people that I just get proposed. Like last week I saw a deepfake of German Chancellor Olaf Scholz being depicted with a mullet, and he was describing on some German TV show how he grew his hair back. And I a year ago would have probably been like, hey, Henry, look at this. Now I'm kind of like, yet another one. I don't want to be like, well, maybe the number will increase, it's going to explode, it's going to be there anyway, but maybe that's the desensitization that needs to be happening. Again, I might be totally wrong, because maybe there are still some that are so precise that are not ridiculous but are serious, and we take. But do you guys have any thoughts on this?
So I think you're absolutely right. I do think we're already starting to see some of that desensitization already. To the point where, my parents used to do the exact same thing. They'd be like, hey, it's the deepfake, this is your thing, right? And now they're like, okay, that's even all the time, whatever. But I think the challenge is, it's where the desensitization happens. If it's on your TikTok feed, fine. But if you're an investigative journalist who's been sent an anonymous tip, including voice audio saying, look, I'm a whistleblower at this big company, or I'm in politics, this needs to be heard, I'm scared of my safety, so I'm not going to tell you who I am. Here's the thing, you can run the story.
Doesn't happen though. That's the thing. I'm contacted by whistleblowers all the time. Like, wait in line, honey. So like traditional media, first traditional media, even ridiculous media is probate. I mean, we are pretty responsible about that. But secondly, there's a huge amount of laws that we are aware of. And thirdly, even if we were to get it through our editor, try getting it through your general counsel. So luckily, I mean, I would say this is a thin reed to lean on, but luckily, in that domain, I wouldn't really see that as being the trigger of seeding misinformation into the news.
Interesting. That's not necessarily what I've heard from other news organizations.
I'm certain I'm an outlier.
I guess my point broadly, on this is, it's good to build into the public and into people a sense of this is happening, this is what the new state of the art is with this technology, this is the impact it's going to have on the digital media you see and hear every day. Yeah. But if we don't provide people with a way out and then say, well, just let you know, you can't trust anything anymore. Good luck. That's just going to lead to reality apathy. That's going to be, the thing that enables the lies. Dividend this concept of just being able to dismiss anything as a deepfake. Yeah. And for key people like investigative journalists, like people in, let's say, potentially government and intelligence, we need to have some way to try and get to as close and robust an answer as possible. at the moment, I'm just not sure what the conditions, the sufficient conditions for making an authority claim.
I'm very keen to, before we end, to poll the audience. May I do that now?
Go for it.
Having listened for an hour and a half to the case for elections and deepfakes and AI, do you feel that it's more sizzle than steak, which is to say, smoke no fire, a lot of talk, a lot of potential problem, but it's not going to be hugely problematic because people have already made up their minds and we've had fake news forever, versus shit show? That 2024 is going to be known as the era in which the whole public sphere collapsed and you couldn't trust anything, and elections could be fraudulent or not, you'd never really know because just the information commons is rubble. Between one or the other, more sizzle than steak, or, pardon my French, shit show. Raise your hand for more sizzle than steak. Okay, Dune, shit show. So it's basically 46.3%.
More about, we're okay now, what happens next time?
Okay, and for those of you who are very nervous about the future, raise your hand. So, outlier, okay. Only one long-term thinking person. It was almost half. It was almost half and half. A little bit more people, I think, were tending towards thinking that it would be okay.
Thank you so much. Okay, well, first of all, thank you so much to all of our speakers for joining us here today. I think the conversation has been fantastic, precisely because I think it helped us filter out a little bit what is sort of some of the dystopian thinking that people have, what are sort of some of the actual changes that I think might be happening, such as, for example, a change in what we consider to be authentic, a change in sort of like what we consider to be ultimately truth on some level as well. And I think this has really been great. And so I would like to thank our speakers here for joining us also for this panel discussion. We'll be around you, so if you guys have any questions, just feel free to reach out. Other than that, yeah, I'll hand the floor back to Diane.
Thank you all very much. Thank you, speakers. Thank you for coming along, to you in the audience. And please stay in touch. Bennett Institute hashtag and handle up there. We've got a newsletter, we've got podcasts, we've got lots of reports, and we've got lots of previous events on our website. Also, Minderoo has stuff on their website, Centre for Future Intelligence on their website too. So stay in touch with us all, and we'll carry on the conversation next time. Thank you all very much.